Hello, beautiful people, and welcome back to day 8 of genetics. Happy Tuesday. It's a new day and a new opportunity for me to make a fool of myself on these videos. So let's get to it. Today's aim is how do humans create new varieties of plants and animals? Now, when we talk about creating here, this word, we're talking about genetically modifying. So it is our genetics unit. So obviously we're talking about doing something with the genetics of these organisms. So I'm going to write down genetically modifying or changing. And when we talk about varieties, we're talking about kinds or types. So how do humans genetically modify new kinds or types of plants and animals? Let's find out. All right. So to start us off, we have a passage that I'm going to read to you. I'm going to annotate or underline important things as we go along, and I want you to do the same on your paper, because at the end of this passage, there are 4 questions that you need to answer, and all of those answers can be found in this passage. So this passage is about selective breeding. For thousands of years, we have produced new varieties of plants and animals. We did this by selectively breeding plants and animals for particular traits. To breed means to mate or reproduce. Selective breeding takes advantage of genetic variation occurring in nature. In other words, the great variety found in wild plants and animals makes selective breeding possible. Selective breeding is often called artificial selection because rather than letting nature decide what animals breed, humans intervene. Humans use selective breeding to pass wanted traits to the next generation of organisms. American botanist Luther Burbank may have been the greatest selective breeder of all time. He developed more than 800 kinds of plants. Burbank used selective breeding to cross or mate organisms that have different traits to bring together the best of both organisms. The offspring made by such crosses are called hybrids. Many of Burbank's hybrid crosses mixed the disease resistance of one plant with the food-making ability of another. The results were new lines of plants that had the traits farmers needed to make more food. All right, so these pictures below show us another example of selective breeding. Humans do this with dog breeds as well. So here we have the breed, the Labrador Retriever. I actually have a lab back home at my parents' place. And here we have a poodle. And somewhere down the line, a human decided to mate these two animals together, a lab and a poodle, and created a new breed of dog called the Labradoodle. And you can see that this Labradoodle has traits or characteristics of both the original Labrador as well as the poodle. So that is just one example of selective breeding in action. We see this a lot with dogs or with horses and plants as well. So now using this information, let's answer these questions. So question number 1 says, based upon what you read, define selective breeding in a complete sentence. Well, we saw in the passage that selective breeding is where scientists take or decide what traits they want to pass on. If they see a plant that has, I think one example was a great ability to make food, and then they saw another plant with disease resistance, and they say, hey, if we cross these two together, we can make a plant that has both disease resistant and makes great food. So based off of that, we can infer that, that selective breeding is when humans choose which animals and plants to breed together in order to pass on wanted traits to the offspring. So when humans choose which animals and plants breed together in order to pass on wanted traits to the offspring. So I mentioned we also see this with racehorses. I'll write down an example of that. All right, so racehorses, let's say that we've got one horse. Should I attempt to draw a horse? Oh God. Oh my. All right, well, that is just beautiful. I hope that made you laugh. So let's say that this horse has great, or is really fast. So this is a fast horse. And scientists decide to mate it with a horse. Oh man, the time to be alive. All right, there's my other horse. And let's say this is a really strong horse. Well, if we decide to selectively breed these horses, when we combine them together, they're going to result in a new horse. Let's make him blue. And he's basically the superhero of all horses, right? He is going to be fast and strong. All right, so selective breeding is when we take two good traits and we breed them together to combine those traits so we see both in an organism. So first we started with one fast horse and one strong horse. We bred those two together, and now we have a horse that's both fast and strong, and he is going to win all of the gold medals in these horses. I'll give him a gold star. All right, he's number one. You go, horsey, you go. All right. Now that I have shown you all I'm clearly Picasso, let's keep going. So number 2 says fill in the blank. Selective breeding is also referred to as blank. So you may or may not have seen this in the passage. Another vocab word that we use for selective breeding is called artificial selection. Now, I guess I haven't touched on what these words actually mean, so I'm going to break them down really quickly. So when we say selective breeding, if we say selective, we're talking about like you're choosing something. So I'm going to write choosing next to selective. And when we talk about breeding, we're talking about mating individuals. So selective breeding is really talking about choosing what to mate. So you might be choosing what animals to mate. You might be choosing what plants to mate. But the key really is that word selective, because you are choosing something specifically. And that's similar to the word choices found in artificial selection. When we say selecting, we're still talking about choosing something. And when we say the word artificial, we're talking about something that's not natural. And in this case, it's man-made, right? The human is intervening and saying, this is what I want to choose. It's not, these animals aren't just naturally mating in the wild. It's artificially done, meaning that it's almost produced by humans, because humans have such a hand in choosing which organisms to mate. Right, I'm gonna go on to the next slide. If you have any questions as we go through this, please write them down and I will answer them tomorrow. All right, number 3, in the text, Luther Burbank was able to create a plant that produced food and resisted a certain disease. So it produced food and resisted a certain disease. How did he do this? Well, the key here really is that word and, because it could do both of these things. So the correct answer, as I'm sure you all know, is by crossing a disease-resistant plant with a food-making plant to create a hybrid which had both traits. Now, when we say by crossing, we're talking about selective breeding. So he crossed a disease-resistant plant with a food-making plant to create a hybrid which had both traits. Now, hybrid, I think it said in the passage, is talking about an organism that has traits Um, how can I say this? Organism that is, let's say, that is produced. Organism that is produced. Oh no, I'm still erasing. Oh, organism produced by selective breeding. So it's a hybrid, meaning that it has both of these traits. It has both the food making trait and the disease resistant trait. So when you combine those two together, we come up with a hybrid or a mix of something. So I guess next to hybrid, I'll write mix. All right, number 4, we talked about this. The Labradoodle is a product of selective breeding. Explain what this statement means. So we've talked about selective breeding. We know that this is talking about choosing what animals or plants mate. So choosing mate. And what you need to write down is that the Labradoodle is a result of humans mating together, a Labrador Retriever, and a Poodle. I know that my writings covered this up a bit, so I'm going to take it off for a minute so you can write that down. The Labradoodle is a result of humans mating together, a Labrador Retriever, and a Poodle. Oh, go back. Now, keep in mind, where are we? Keep in mind that this is a result of humans mating together. So once again, this is artificial, it's not natural. So humans had a hand in this. Humans decided to mate that Labrador with a poodle and create a Labradoodle. So this is once again an example of selective breeding because humans are choosing that mate. Great. So here's an example of how selective breeding can go wrong. Because it is artificial and humans are in charge of it, we create a lot of human error, things that wouldn't normally happen naturally if we weren't involved. And one of the examples is this lovely bulldog right here. The bulldog is a product of inbreeding, of selective breeding, all at the hands of humans. And because of that, we really screwed this poor bulldog up. Because of their nose shape, they have a really hard time breathing. Um, I'm pretty sure they have arthritis in their joints because their legs are not shaped correctly. Um, this tongue in itself is a problem. It's hanging out of its mouth. Their eyes are droopy. They're prone to, I think, asthma. But really, the moral of the story is we have really screwed these bulldogs up so much that they can't even mate on their own. They are physically incapable of mating without human help. Uh, so this is just one example of how selective breeding can go terribly wrong if we get too involved in this process. Oh, bless the bulldog. All right, here's another example of how selective breeding can go wrong. These are examples of ligers. So when humans decide to mate together lions and tigers, we get what is called a liger. Now, one huge problem with ligers is that they are way too big. So they end up having a lot of health problems just because their anatomy can't support how big they become. Their organs can't keep up with how big they've become. And they end up disrupting ecosystems because they eat so much. They're genuinely just huge organisms that shouldn't happen and wouldn't happen naturally if humans didn't get involved. So normally lions and tigers can't mate. They're from different species, so they won't naturally mate on their own. But if humans force them to mate together, we do come up with this new species called a liger. However, those ligers are prone to many defects, as I said, and don't survive very long on their own. Now, if you have been binge watching Tiger King on Netflix, you may recognize this guy. This is I think his name is Don Mantle. I didn't realize who he was until I just sat down and looked at this PowerPoint. But if you haven't watched it already and you have a Netflix account, I would highly recommend Tiger King on Netflix because every time you think it can't get crazier, it gets crazier. But you will see this guy on there. Um, all right, bring it back. But once again, this is just another example of how selective breeding can go wrong because these organisms wouldn't be wouldn't naturally occur on their own. They only appear in what's the word I'm looking for? They only appear when humans force them to mate, and that can cause some pretty rough problems. Now, here are some words of the day that you need to write down. These are vocab words that you will see both on your test as well as the Regents at the end of the year. This word, words, genetic engineering. Now, when we talk about genetic engineering, we're talking about the deliberate modification of the characteristics of an organism by manipulating its genetic material. Now, that's a lot of words, so we're going to break it down. When we say deliberate, we're talking about intentional. I can't write. Intentional or on purpose. So deliberate means we intend to do it. We're doing it on purpose. Now, modification is talking about changing something. And finally, the last word I'm going to break down for you is manipulating. So manipulating is another word for changing, but in this context, we're talking about humans changing. So human intervention. Oh, where'd it go? Hold on. Did I just lose all of that? I think I did. All right, I lost all that text, but I'll write it again. But to recap, when we say deliberate, we're talking about intentional or on purpose. When we say modification, we're talking about changing something. I guess I can break one more down for you. When we say characteristics, we're talking about traits. And finally, manipulating, we're talking about human intervention. Oh my word, did I lose it again? Guys, I keep bumping something that's ruining my slides. Well, I hope by now you've gotten that because I'm just going to write down this last part. Manipulating, we're talking about human intervention. So humans are doing the changing. Humans are changing things purposely. All right, okay, bear with me, I'm gonna do this again. Deliberate means on purpose. Modification means changing. And characteristics, we're talking about traits. All right, fingers crossed I don't mess this up again. All right, so that is genetic engineering. When humans change something on purpose, change the traits of an organism by manipulating its genetic material. So that phrase genetic material is important because that brings us back to today's aim. We're trying to figure out how do humans mess with the genetics of animals? And this is one of those ways. Another word of the day that we need to know is something called selective breeding. Now, I've said that word approximately 37 times since the beginning of this recording. What you need to know for that is that this is the process by which humans choose which animals or plants mate together to selectively develop particular genetic traits in offspring. Whew. Once again, that was a lot of words, so I'm going to read it one more time a little bit slower. Selective breeding is the process by which humans choose which animals or plants mate together to selectively develop particular genetic traits in offspring. So if we break that down, the key phrase here is humans choosing, because we are deciding what traits to pass on. Once again, I broke this down earlier, but when we talk about selective breeding, we're talking about choosing. So selective means choosing, and breeding, we're talking about mating. So selective breeding is talking about when humans choose which animals get to mate. So we choose which animals or plants mate together to selectively, remember we're choosing, develop particular genetic traits in an offspring. So once again, I'm going to underline genetic traits because this goes back to our aim. We're trying to figure out how do we create new organisms through those or by manipulating those genetic traits. And this is another example. So we use selective breeding to decide which traits get passed on in different organisms. All right, and let's go on to the next one. So this is a think, pair, share. With your partner, who doesn't exist, write a complete sentence explaining why selective breeding is a form of genetic engineering. So obviously, ignore that first part. You're not going to do this with a partner because, as far as I'm aware, you don't have a partner sitting at home with you. I mean, if you want to talk to your sibling about how this works, go for it. If you want to come up with an imaginary friend to discuss this with, go for it. But right now, I just want you on your own to write a complete sentence explaining why selective breeding is a form of genetic engineering. So I'm not going to go over this with you. This is going to be something you do on your own. Just make sure it is typed in your document before you press submit. So I want a complete sentence talking about why selective breeding is a form of genetic engineering. So you will use both of these definitions that we just went over and tell me, why is this a form of this? All right. Next up, we've got a trait about selective breeding resulting in advances in agriculture. Specifically, we're going to be talking about corn. So once again, I'm going to read through this passage with you and underline anything important. Long before Europeans came to the New World, Native Americans had selectively bred teosinte. Teosinte is a wild grass native to central Mexico. Teosinte was selectively bred to make corn. Corn is a far more productive and nutritious plant than teosinte. Corn is now also one of the world's most important crops. Modern corn was selectively bred from teosinte at least 6,000 years ago. Over time, the hard case around the kernel disappeared, which left the rows of soft kernels we enjoy today. The plant has also been bred to become larger and produce more. So this is going to be another question you answer on your own. I will be checking it through Google Classroom tomorrow, but I want you to imagine you're sitting at the dinner table, maybe even tonight, and a giant bowl of corn is placed on the table. You say to the other people at the table, "Did you know that corn wasn't always like that?" Your little sister or brother looks at you and says, "You're weird," and she doesn't believe you, or he doesn't believe you. Now, I want you to explain to that younger sibling how modern corn developed from teosinte. So once again, you are going to explain how modern corn developed from teosinte. In your response, be sure to identify and explain the process used. So I'll give you a hint. I have underlined that process used somewhere in this passage. So as you write this example, please refer to the passage to create your response of how modern corn was developed from teosinte. Now, if you want to pause this video and write down your response, you are more than welcome to, but I will be checking that tomorrow. So please write that on your answer sheet. We press on. Now, we've got some practice questions that I want to go over with you guys. So we're going to go through these together and break them down one by one. Number one says, which is a breeding method? So we're talking about mating. Mating. Which is a breeding method used by humans to produce new varieties of plants and animals. So here we are talking about humans intervening because it is used by humans. Number one says independent assortment, which if you think back to our, I think the beginning of our genetics unit, we're talking about alleles independently assorting. So I don't think that's going to be our answer. Number two, natural selection. Now this is a product of evolution. So I don't know if that's going to be the correct answer either. Number three says artificial selection. Now, I think I remember seeing another phrase for artificial selection, but if we break this down, artificial means not natural, and selection means choosing. we'll come back to that one. And number 4 says crossing over. Now, once again, this was part of our, I think, reproduction unit, where we're talking about different genes crossing over um, to increase genetic variation. Now, if we look at all of these, there's only one that humans have a direct control over. Last time I checked, we don't get to choose which alleles independently assort. We don't get to choose how evolution happens, and we don't get to choose how our genes increase genetic variation. The only thing that humans have control over out of these 4 answers is going to be 3 artificial selection. Now, you may have already written it down, but another phrase we use for artificial selection is selective breeding. And once again, when we talk about selective breeding, we are talking about choosing a mate, or choosing which animals mate, rather. And that is directly used by humans to produce new varieties of plants. So the correct answer for number 1 is 3. Number 2, one variety of strawberry is resistant to a damaging fungus but produces small fruit. Another strawberry variety produces large fruit but is not resistant to the same fungus. The 2 desirable qualities may be combined in a new variety of strawberry plant by what? So we are talking about taking 2 different organisms with valuable traits, making them mate, so combining them, mating them, and creating a new variety of strawberry plant. Now we're trying to figure out what process we can do that through. So number 1 says cloning. When we talk about cloning, we're talking about making an identical copy. All right, number 2, asexual reproduction is when there's only one parent. And once again, that offspring is going to be identical. Number 3 is called direct harvesting. We haven't even talked about this, but the word harvesting is talking about like harvesting crops. Oh no. Oh, I did it again. I bumped the button. Well, bear with me, guys. All right. All right, so one more time, quickly. Cloning is talking about identical copy. Number 2 is talking about asexual reproduction, which is one parent making identical offspring. Number 3 is talking about direct harvesting. We haven't talked about this, and we won't, if I'm being honest. However, if we're talking about harvesting, we're talking about like picking crops. Oh my word, I did it again. Guys, I'm sorry. You're witnessing my demise every single time. Okay, I'm not gonna write those again, but this is talking about picking up crops. And finally, number 4, selective breeding. We have heard this a million times. Remember, we're talking about choosing a mate or choosing which animals or plants mate. And the reason we do this is to pick the best traits. Now, in this example, we're told that one variety of strawberry is resistant to a damaging fungus, which is a good thing, but it produces small fruit, which is probably a bad thing. Another strawberry produces large fruit, which is a good thing, but it is not resistant to the same fungus. So here, by combining these 2 plants, we take these 2 good traits and we're trying to make a bigger and better strawberry. We're trying to make the best strawberry. And we do that through selective breeding. All right, number 3, research applications of the basic principles of genetics have contributed greatly to the rapid production of new varieties of plants and animals. Which activity is an example of such an application? Now, once more, since we're talking about producing new varieties of organisms, we're talking about creating new breeds or new species, or not species, but new breeds or new types of plants or animals. Um, Now, in this context, we're talking about humans doing it. So humans are the ones producing these organisms, meaning it's not natural, but it's artificial. So the answer choices here are number 1, production of new fertilizers for food crops. Number 2, breeding of plants and animals that exhibit high resistance to disease. Number 3, developing new irrigation methods to conserve water. Or number 4, using natural predators to control insect pests. Now, only one of these is talking about producing new varieties of plants and animals. Number 1 is talking about making new fertilizers, which is not a plant or an animal. Number 2 is talking about breeding new plants and animals that exhibit high resistance to disease. Okay, we'll come back to that one. Number 3, developing new irrigation methods to conserve water. Once again, conserving water is not talking about developing new organisms or new varieties of plants and animals, rather. And number 4, using natural predators to control pests. Now, if we're controlling pests, we're not exactly creating new varieties of plants and animals. And additionally, we just said that this is an artificial process, which means it's not done naturally. It's not done with natural predators. So the only rational answer here for developing new varieties of plants and animals is going to be number 2, the breeding of plants and animals that exhibit high resistance to disease. Now, number 2, once again, is just another way of saying this is selective breeding. So once again, humans are in charge of breeding these animals and breeding these plants to choose the best traits. So in this case, it was high resistance to disease because we're trying to make our plants and animals survive longer and be stronger and healthier. All right, so the correct answers for each of these questions were number 3, number 4, and number 2. All right, number 4, a biologist at an agriculture laboratory is asked to develop a better quality blueberry plant. I'm going to underline the word, circle the word develop because we're creating. So create. Hope you can read that. We're creating a better quality blueberry plant. He is given plants that produce unusually large blueberries. So one of them produces huge blueberries. And we've got another type of plant that produces very sweet blueberries. Now, you're tasked with describing one way the biologist could use these blueberry plants to develop a plant with blueberries that are both large and sweet. Now, I hope that you catch the drift that we're heading in. We're talking about developing or creating a plant with blueberries that are both large and sweet. Now we have one plant that has large blueberries and we have one plant that has sweet blueberries. So what is the name of the process by which we could combine the plant with large blueberries and combine the plant with sweet blueberries to make a plant that has both large and sweet blueberries? Think about my horrible drawings of horses at the beginning of class, and think about the process that we used to make that superhero horse. If you haven't caught on yet, I will tell you, we are talking about selective breeding. Or also known as artificial selection. Now, because I don't have enough space to write on here with this crappy stylus, I'm not going to write out the full explanation. I want you to do that on your own. So I have told you the name of the process, and I want you to describe that process. So on your own, describe how that's going to happen. Describe what that scientist needs to do in order for this to be successful. All right, Number 5, which statement provides accurate information about the technique illustrated below? So here we have two types of plants coming together to produce a new type of plant. Now, since we have two parents, this is an example of sexual reproduction. Okay, so this one is talking about we have a diseased African plant and we're crossing it with a healthy plant. We're crossing the diseased African cotton plant with the healthy American cotton plant. And as a result, we produce healthy cotton produced to grow in Africa. Now let's read through these options. Number 1 says this technique results in offspring that are genetically identical to the parents. Okay, so genetically identical. Now we know genetically identical offspring are a result of asexual reproduction with one parent, but here we have two parents, and I told you it's sexual reproduction. So if it's sexual reproduction, that means we're going to have genetic variation. Variation. All right. So I don't think it's going to be number 1 because it doesn't look like this plant is identical to these two. Number 2, this technique is used by farmers to eliminate mutations in future members of the species. Can we prevent mutations from happening? Is that something that we have the technology to do yet? Maybe, but in this example, I don't think it's relevant. There's nothing in this passage or in this question that's talking about mutations in future species or in future members of the species. So I'm going to put a maybe there, but I'm not convinced that that's our answer. Number 3, new varieties of organisms can be developed by this technique. All right, so we're talking about new varieties developed by this technique. I like the direction that that's heading in, but we'll come back to it. And number 4, since the development of cloning, this technique is no longer used in agriculture. Now, this passage does not tell us anything about the development of cloning. There's nothing in this question that makes me think we're talking about cloning. Remember that cloning means we are creating an identical, my screen has been, okay. It won't let me write there because my drawing board is down there. So I can't write the word copy, but just imagine that it's there. Cloning, we're talking about creating identical copies. And once again, in this passage or in this question, we're not talking about creating an identical copy. This is a new variety of species that has traits different from what we see in each parent. So I don't think that this is telling us anything about cloning. So now let's go back to number 3. New varieties of organisms can be developed by this technique. So in this picture, we see an African plant being crossed with an American plant. We see a diseased plant being crossed with a healthy plant. And when those two come together, they form a new type of plant. So now we have a healthy plant that is produced to grow in Africa. So it's taking this healthy trait from this plant and this African trait from this plant, crossing them together and creating a new variety. Now, when this happens, when we choose which plants to mate together and selectively choose which traits are passed on, once again, this is known as selective breeding. So number 5 is selective breeding. And we are producing new varieties of organisms. So the correct answer for this is going to be number 3. All right. All right, number 6 and number 7, I'm not going to go over. I want you to do them on your own. So read through number 6 and 7, do on your own, and answer on your worksheet. For number 7, I will say it's easier if you break this down into and answer it by bullet point. So answer the first question as one bullet point, answer the second question as one bullet point. All right, but once again, do these on your own and I will check them tomorrow. Finally, the last thing we're going to go over is just some quick vocab review. We have used this first word so many times, and I will probably cry if you don't know it by now. But the word homeostasis, we're talking about a stable, internal environment. Yay! I really hope you all knew that. If you didn't, please write it down. You will see that word so many times. Homeostasis is talking about a stable internal environment. Now, this is why we always have you annotate it, because it'll come up again. All right, the next vocab word is enzyme. Now, if you think way back to, I think it was Unit 2 or Unit 3, we talked about enzymes, but we keep seeing enzymes pop up in each of our units. So I wanted to refresh you on this definition. Enzymes are proteins, remember that speed up the rate of reaction. So they make processes that would normally happen pretty slow, they make them happen faster. And remember that an easy way to spot an enzyme is that it ends in the 3 letters ASE. So recently we talked about restriction enzymes. We also talked about RNA polymerase. Remember that ASE means it's an enzyme. And finally, gel electrophoresis is something we talked about yesterday. It looks something like this. Remember, with the DNA strands that are separated? So through this process, gel electrophoresis, we're talking about a process that separates DNA fragments according to size. Oh, my iPad's given up, guys. Oh, all right, according to size. And just a few quick things. Remember that the negative end of the gel is on this side. This is where the DNA is inserted. The positive end is on this side. And when we plug it in, this requires electricity. Those DNA fragments are going to be pulled towards the positive side. And that happens because we know DNA is negative and it's attracted to that positive end. So it wants to be pulled towards the positive side. And finally, last thing, you all should know that the smaller molecules or smaller fragments of DNA make it all the way to the positive side. They're small, they can move really fast. Meanwhile, those bigger molecules, those bigger fragments are stuck at the top. They can't run quite as fast and they don't move as fast either. So the smaller molecules are fast, they are pulled all the way to the positive end. The bigger fragments are so heavy they can't even start the race. They stay put at the negative end and can't travel quite as far. And I believe that's all we have for you. Yep, that is it. So if you have any questions, once again, please write them down and we will answer them tomorrow. Oh my, I'm skipping all sorts of days. There it is. If you have any questions, write them down and I will answer them tomorrow. Other than that, have a wonderful day and I will see you guys tomorrow.